Welcome back, everybody, to 10-Minute I.O., where you'll find bite-sized information on all topics related to industrial organizational psychology. My name is Stephen Jong, and I'm an I.O. psychologist or practitioner, and today we'll be talking about types of job interviews. Now, you may be asking yourself, there's more than one kind of job interview? The answer is yes. We do have three major classes of job interviews. We'll be talking about three in particular. On the left, you'll see conventional interviews. In the middle, structured, and to the right, structured behavioral interviews. On the horizontal bar, their accuracy goes from left to right, with conventional interviews being least accurate and structured behavioral interviews being most accurate. There's some pros and cons to each of these approaches. You can see that conventional interviews are most common. In fact, probably all organizations use some sort of a conventional interview process. They require less effort, and I'll explain why that is. They also tend to be less accurate. On the other hand, you see with structured behavioral interviews, they're less common. They require a little more effort, not a huge amount, but certainly a little more effort than your conventional interviews. They also tend to be far more accurate than conventional interviews, and I'll explain why in a second. So let's look at each of these more carefully. Conventional interviews require little or no planning. I call it quick and dirty interviewing approach. What I mean by that is that they are not often tied to the job itself and the specific tasks that the candidate or the employee will be asked to do. They're also associated with asking different questions to different candidates. So imagine you going into a technical interview and you ask the questions like, tell me about the pros and cons of Java versus Ruby on Rails. Give me the history of Ruby on Rails. And then you find out later that the candidate that went before you were asked questions like, tell me what's your favorite hobby? What do you do on the weekends? You can imagine different types of questions will vary in their difficulty, and it would be unfair for you to get the questions that you were given versus the candidate that went before you to get very easy questions, and then that candidate being hired because of that. Now, for those reasons, conventional interviews are open to more biases, cognitive biases, and implicit biases, because there's really relatively no structure or standardization. And for those reasons, we have a validity coefficient of around 0.2, relatively low. Validity coefficient is nothing more than a correlation between your interview performance and, assuming you were hired, your job performance, let's say 6 months or 12 months down the road. So it's simply a correlation that goes from 0 to 1, and it basically reflects the relationship between your performance on the interview and your job performance. Ideally, we want that validity coefficient to be high. With structured interviews, just quickly, structured interviews and structured behavioral interviews are essentially the same. The only difference being that structured behavioral interviews incorporate what are called behavioral interview questions. So structured interviews require or are associated with planning. Oftentimes the job, what's called a job analysis. So the job is analyzed and broken down into specific tasks. Based on each of those tasks, specific knowledge, skills, abilities, and personality traits are inferred. And based on those requirements, the questions are developed so that they capture specifically those qualities that are likely to facilitate performance on those specific tasks. Questions for all candidates are the same, and this is to ensure fairness and objectivity, because if we ask different questions to different candidates, it becomes very difficult to really gauge their performance on those responses and in turn how they will do on the actual job. Because the questions are standardized and because the questions are based on the job itself, they're less vulnerable to biases, the whim of the interviewer. And it's reflected in the validity coefficient, the higher validity coefficient of 0.35. With the structured behavioral interviews, as I mentioned, this is exactly the same as structured interview. The only difference here being incorporation of behavioral interview questions. And because of that, because behavioral interview questions tend to bring some value, it bumps up the validity coefficient to around 0.48. Now, depending on which paper you look at, these numbers, these point estimates will vary. But these numbers are based on my assessment of the literature that's out there on interviewing. Just quickly on conventional interviews, why we don't recommend it. I mentioned some of these already, but I just want to list those here. They're more susceptible to candidate characteristics. Some candidates are simply better at interviewing. They look better, and they just give that impression that they would be better on the job, which may or may not be the case in many instances. Similarity effects. I think we all know by now that we tend to like others who are more like ourselves. And this is not me talking, but the research showing that race, gender, interests, values, those things matter. And this is one of the reasons why salespeople, when they first get in touch with their prospect, they'll try to identify something that they have in common with that prospect. Snap decisions. We tend to make hiring decisions very quickly based on their resume, based on their looks. The first few minutes is really what it requires. And there's research showing that we already made the decision in the first 5 minutes, so the rest of the interview really doesn't matter. Tendency to give weight to superficial background characteristics. Think about names, nationality, accents. There's research showing that if you have names that sound African American, there's less likelihood of the company calling you back than if you were to have more traditional European sounding names like Robert, Judy, Cindy, and so on. Poor recall. Interviewers often, if you don't write things down during the interview, interviewers tend to remember information that are just more salient to them. It could be something that the candidate said. It could be something about the background of the candidate. And they may or may not be relevant to, regardless of whether they're relevant to the job itself, they tend to be given more weight. Because of these factors, and there's many more than just the 5 I list here, they contribute to less consistent results, or we call reliability, lower reliability in the results. For these reasons, they tend to suppress that validity coefficient that I talked about earlier. With structured interviews, why do we recommend it? Because the question is based on job analysis, a careful examination of what the candidate will be asked to do on the job. And what that means is breaking down the job to specific tasks, working with computers, working with people, calculating, and so on. And based on that information, you want to infer, again, those specific individual attributes like knowledge, skills, abilities, and personality traits. And then the questions are based on those individual attributes. So they tend to be much more objective. Same questions are asked of each candidate. And this is to standardize and make the interview process more fair. And research shows that when you ask the same questions of all candidates, the results tend to be, again, closer to, or much more accurate and closer to the truth. Response from each question to the candidate are numerically evaluated. So there's a scoring sheet. So it's not just my impression of how the candidate did on this particular question, but there's actual scoring sheet that is systematically developed to identify what would be an average response, what would be a poor response, what would be a great response. And so all interviewers have that, and they use the same scoring sheet to evaluate each candidate. Detailed notes are taken, and part of this is because they want to, after they go through interview a candidate, typically the interviewers will want to get together and exchange notes to ensure that they are focusing on the right attributes of the candidate. The last two here, validity coefficients, you'll have varying validity coefficient depending on which research, but McDaniel's found about a 0.37 validity coefficient. Huffcut found about a 0.56. And so the truth, or the real actual correlation, or the validity coefficient should lie somewhere in between there. Now, if you were to incorporate these and then on top of that, take it up to the next level by incorporating behavior-based interview questions, you'll see that the validity coefficient will increase dramatically. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to share the video with future IO practitioners. I'll try to post one every Sunday, so hope to see you back on next Sunday. Thank you.